Hello, this is Mike Smulligan with the Michigan Forest Stewardship Program. This is the second in a three-part series on forest carbon credits, and we're going to take a little deeper dive into the science and policy related to forest carbon credits. As of March 2023, the policy side is changing rapidly, and I'll try to give you an overview of where we're at right now. But let's start with the science. And this is some basic science, going all the way back to middle and high school, the things that we learned about in terms of photosynthesis, where photosynthesis is trees and other plants that are removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and transforming that into sugars and oxygen. And as a tree and other plants are growing, the wood that is growing in that tree is coming directly from the atmosphere. Now, if you were to cut down that tree and dry out the wood, about half of the dry biomass in a tree is carbon that came into that tree from photosynthesis from the atmosphere. Sorry, I can't say that word today. And now this is a significant process because Michigan's forests are sequestering about 12% of our state's greenhouse gas emissions. So we have 20 million acres of forest in Michigan, and as those 20 million acres of forest, about 14 billion living trees, according to the Forest Service inventory and analysis, those 14 billion living trees are removing 12% of our state's greenhouse gas emissions. Now, where does this carbon go? As a tree is growing and removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, the carbon goes into six major carbon pools. The first is the above ground biomass. That's the trunk and the branches and the leaves. That's about 22% of the carbon in Michigan forests. The below ground biomass is the roots, and a smaller pool, only about 4% of the carbon in Michigan's forests. Deadwood, standing dead wood or down dead wood, that's also about 4% of the carbon stocks in Michigan forests. Litter, the leaves and the twigs, the dead leaves that are on the surface of the ground, and then the soil organic matter pool. So as those leaves and twigs and dead wood decomposes, much of that carbon is incorporated into the soil. And because Michigan is part of the temperate climate, almost to the southern end of the boreal climate, we have a relatively cold, relatively wet climate, and so much of the carbon stays in our soils in soil organic matter. And that's actually the largest carbon pool in Michigan's forests, about 65%. Now, I enjoy talking to loggers about forest carbon credits, and loggers in particular, but also many landowners are interested in harvested wood products. So when we cut down a tree and turn that log into 2x4s or flooring or all the other different forest products, we're locking up that carbon into those harvested wood products for significant amounts of time. And we are not returning that carbon to the atmosphere if that 2x4 goes into a building for decades or longer. So that's a pool that is often included in national forest or national carbon inventories. Harvested wood products are not typically included in carbon offset credit protocols simply because it's a little more challenging to measure those at the per ownership level. We're looking at more statewide or national economic data to help quantify harvested wood products. Now, even though in Michigan we are sequestering carbon from the atmosphere and our forests are a sink where they're taking in much more carbon they are releasing, that's not the case globally. Now, AFOLO is agriculture, forestry, and other land uses, and globally, agriculture, forestry, and other land uses is still somewhere in the 22 to 24% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Much of this is coming from land use change, where tropical countries like Brazil and the Congo and Indonesia are converting forests into agricultural systems, where they may be draining wet tropical forests and converting them into palm oil plantations, or converting forests into pasture to grow beef. So all of these global land use changes and other parts of the agricultural systems are a source of greenhouse gas emissions globally. Now, the good news is that even though global deforestation is still significant and still a huge problem, the rates are declining. So the world is making some progress in slowing the rate of deforestation. We still have way too much deforestation. There's still too many countries around the world that are converting forests into agriculture and other land uses, but the rate is slowing over previous decades. Now, a little bit about climate change itself in Michigan. I'm not going to talk very much about climate change. I'm going to focus more on carbon pools rather than a changing climate. I have not studied much about the atmospheric sciences and all the things going on with climate science. But just a few things that I've been reading. There's some good information out there on some of these state summaries of what's happening regarding climate change. And here in Michigan, the data are showing that since 1900, temperatures have risen 3 degrees Fahrenheit. And much of this warming is occurring in the winter. We're having warmer, wetter winters. Just this past year, the frost laws came on in the Lower Peninsula in early February rather than late March. We're also getting some extreme precipitation events. Where remember a couple years ago in 2016, the Western Upper Peninsula had an 11 inches of rain in only 4 hours. So we're starting to see some of these types of climate change impacts already happening here in Michigan. Now, if a landowner is concerned about a changing climate and how this is going to impact their forest, we have a great resource here in Michigan, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, which is a collaboration between the U.S. Forest Service and Michigan Tech and Michigan State and other partners, looking at how we can do a better job managing our forests in a changing climate. And NIAX is putting out some really good publications that are helping landowners and foresters and loggers consider how they are at risk of a changing climate and what are some options that they can do to adapt to a changing climate. And so this table is an example of some of the materials that NIAX is putting out to help landowners evaluate, what types of forests do they have and what are potential risks associated with a changing climate. Then taking a look at what are some adaptation strategies where a landowner can take a look at their risk and then start to come up with a plan on, well, what's a good way to manage this forest where I can try to resist against change or be resilient in the face of a changing climate, or if necessary to make a transition to other types of trees or other types of forests that will be more successful in a changing climate. So again, NIAX is putting out really nice publications that are helping landowners evaluate their risk and evaluate adaptation strategies. And I really appreciate NIAX. They stick with sound science and basic silvicultural practices to help foresters and landowners make informed decisions to be good land managers. Now, zooming back out to the national scale, we've been talking about climate change for at least 30 years here in the United States, at least since the early 1990s. And you can see from this graph here that the United States really hasn't done much to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions over the last 30 years. We've been talking about climate change for quite some time, but our emissions are still holding pretty steady around that 6,000 million metric tons of carbon dioxide that we're emitting. Now, if you take a close look at this figure, you'll see that there's a zero line there, and the green part of the figure below this zero is actually representing how forests across the United States are a sink. That's a negative emission. A negative emission is when the forests are growing and through photosynthesis are removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So that negative emission shows that forests are a sink. Now, nationally, forests are a pretty big sink, but nationally, that sink is declining. in part because fire, especially out west in the mountain and arid forests out west, are becoming or is causing forests to be a source of greenhouse gases. When you have large catastrophic fires, that is going to emit a significant amount of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. That's not the case for Michigan's forests. So this really, does present an opportunity for Michigan's forests to continue to be a sink. And because of that ecological service that our forests are providing, there's an opportunity to place an economic value on that. So again, Michigan's forests are increasing in carbon stocks. They've increased to about 7% since 1990, and that's for a couple of reasons. First, the forest land area in Michigan is stable and even increasing slightly, but it's holding steady right around 20 million acres. So we do have some deforestation in Michigan, but it's quite small, and it's actually offset by other land use converting to forest. We lose about 52,000 acres of forest each year in Michigan to other land uses, but we gain about 54,000 acres of forest from other land uses. So we have net zero deforestation in Michigan. So our land area is stable, and the biomass per acre is increasing. Our forests are relatively healthy and are growing in volume per acre. Our forests are relatively young. We had massive statewide disturbances and harvesting in the 1800s, and our forests are still relatively young. And recovering from that large disturbance in the 1800s. And as they continue to grow, they're getting healthier and more volume. And so our growth here in Michigan exceeds both the mortality and the removals. So biomass per acre is increasing. And we have relatively low emissions from forest fire. Very large fires are rare in Michigan, and fire is not a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions here in Michigan. So overall, our forests are sequestering about 12% of our state's greenhouse gas emissions. This is a breakdown in that sequestration of Michigan's forests. This table is coming from a Forest Service publication on state tables on greenhouse gas emissions, and you can see here from 1990 up to 2018, forests are a large sink. Those numbers in parentheses are negative emissions. And so you can see that our remaining forests, our 20 million acres of forest there, are removing somewhere around 14 million tons of carbon dioxide a year. We have very low emissions from fire. And again, we have very low positive emissions from deforestation. That's the 2 million tons of carbon dioxide are being emitted from land use change. But again, we have more land that's going from non-forest to forest. And so we've got a little over 3 million tons of carbon dioxide each year, where is a sink as forests are recovering. So, and again, even our urban forests, our forests in our cities are also a relatively significant carbon sink, where our urban forests are removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So overall, our forests are somewhere around 19 million tons of carbon dioxide that they're removing from the atmosphere, and that is 12% of our state's roughly 160 million tons of emissions of greenhouse gas. Now at the national level, overall, nationally, it's fairly similar. In looking at some data from 2017, at the national level, our forests, I think it's 766 million acres of forest nationally, sequestered 11% of the United States total greenhouse gas emissions. However, this is not uniform spatially, where in the north and the south and the east, our forests are relatively healthy and are a sink. But out west, where fires are getting much larger, more intense, and more frequent, we're actually seeing fairly significant sources of emissions from greenhouse gases from fire. All right, let's get back here to Michigan's forest, and here you can see some data about our carbon stocks on a per acre basis. And you see there that there's a fair bit of variability in our forest types as far as how much carbon is stored in various forest types. That figure on the left, the blue portion of those lines is the carbon in the organic soil, organic carbon in soil. And you can see there that that's where 65% of our carbon stocks are actually in the soil. The green portion of the bar is the live biomass, both above ground and below ground. And statewide, the average carbon stocks is around 26, 27 tons of carbon per acre in the live biomass. It's interesting that there's some variation between different types of ownership. State forests are the lowest at 23 tons of carbon per acre. Private forests are 27, and then federal forests are the highest at 29 tons of carbon per acre. Well, if we assume an average of 27 tons per carbon, a scientist may look at forest biomass in terms of carbon, but in terms of carbon markets, the unit of measure for carbon offsets and carbon credits and selling carbon on the market is carbon dioxide, and it's actually carbon dioxide equivalents, because there's multiple types of greenhouse gases. All other greenhouse gases are converted to a carbon dioxide equivalent for a uniform measure of greenhouse gases. And so to convert from carbon to carbon dioxide, we multiply by the molecular weight of carbon dioxide, which is 44 divided by 12. So multiply 27 by that 3.66, and we get 99, or we'll call it an even 100 tons of carbon dioxide per acre in Michigan's forests, in the above ground biomass, or the live biomass above and below ground. So that's convenient, where we can kind of, as a rule of thumb, can kind of estimate that Michigan's forests have somewhere around 100 tons of carbon dioxide per acre in the live tree component. Now, I'm going to transition from science to policy, but I do have one slide here on ethics. I think it's important that we always include a discussion on ethics whenever we're talking about greenhouse gases, and even with forest carbon offsets. I think it's important for us Americans to recognize that the West, both the United States and Europe, we have grown rather wealthy by the Industrial Revolution based on fossil fuels over the last couple hundred years, where we have done deforestation at continental levels ourselves. So we've done a significant amount of deforestation here in the United States and converting to other land uses. And our wealth is really based on how we have emitted greenhouse gases over the last several hundred years. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that our wealth is disproportionately harming poor people in the developing world, and that poor people in the developing world are much less able to adapt to a changing climate, and are much less able to invest in the significant costs to adapt to a changing climate and to mitigate a changing climate. So I think it's important that we acknowledge that our wealth is coming at the expense of poor people around the world. And when it comes to forest carbon offsets in particular, I think we need to be honest about some of the limitations of carbon offsets. For one, offsets by design are intended to allow polluters to continue polluting longer and cheaper. An offset gives a polluter an alternative to reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. And there are many environmentalists that are not in favor of offsets at all, because they recognize that if we're going to be serious about climate change, we really need to get serious about reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. So offsets are not a perfect instrument. And there are also quite a few critiques of forest carbon offsets in particular. Um, Forest carbon offsets may not be additional, where we may not be requiring a landowner to change their behavior. IFM is improved forest management, and some of the improved forest management methodologies don't require a landowner to change their behavior, but really are just quantifying the difference between a landowner's current behavior and some assumed hypotheticals. Forest carbon is also not truly permanent. We really want greenhouse gases to be removed from the atmosphere permanently, and forests are susceptible to natural disturbances like fire, insects, ice, wind, disease, land use change. All of those things can cause forests to be a source of greenhouse gases, not a permanent sink. And forest carbon offsets are relatively complex and expensive to measure. And so there are some market failures where small landowners or landowners in underserved communities are not able to access these economic opportunities. And then also there's a fair bit of conversation about, forests being an alternative fuel, and forests certainly are an excellent green energy, and are much lower in terms of greenhouse gases than fossil fuels, but they're not completely carbon neutral. We're still using a lot of greenhouse gases to harvest and transport bioenergy, and so forest products are not entirely carbon neutral. So again, forest carbon offsets are an excellent opportunity for landowners and an important way for forest landowners to make a positive contribution to a healthier planet, but they are not a perfect vehicle, and we need to be honest about their limitations. All right, so let's shift to policy. And a politician's job is to get input from society and get input from scientists about what's the best science, and from society about, what's the best ethical alternatives. And a policymaker's job is to respond to those inputs of science and ethics and say, okay, this is what we're going to do as a result of that information, and these are the policies that we're going to be making to dictate how society is going to respond to this information. And you can see on this long list of policy initiatives that we've been thinking about and talking about humans' impact on the environment for quite some time. 1963 was the Clean Air Act, and 1972 was the Clean Water Act. In 1983, we tried to limit deforestation in the tropics with that International Tropical Timber Agreement. But it's really in 1992 that is the first big global conversation about climate change. And at that Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, there were three major global treaties that came out of that. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is really the foundation for the global response to climate change. But there were a couple of other significant conventions there. The United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, and then the United Nations Convention on Combating Desertification. So the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio was really a major landmark event. And we'll take a closer look at a few of these other policy initiatives since then in the next couple slides here. So again, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, it was adopted at the 1992 Earth Summit, became effective in 1994 after 197 countries agreed to be parties of the convention. And the goal of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions at levels that will not harm the climate. Now, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has an annual conference of parties, often referred to as COP, C-O-P, where each year the conference of parties that are parties to the convention get together and try to figure out how are we going to implement this and how are we going to adapt policies to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions at levels that are not harming the climate. One scientific body that informs the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is the Subsidiary Body for Science and Technological Advice. And their job is to provide the science to the policymakers so that the policymakers can make informed decisions. And the IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and that's one of the scientific bodies that's providing information to the policymakers in order to make decisions about how to respond to climate change. Now, the Kyoto Protocol was adopted in 1997, and it was ratified globally in 2005. Here in the United States, President Clinton signed the Kyoto Protocol in 1998, but the Senate has never actually ratified the Kyoto Protocol. Now, there were 192 parties to the Kyoto Protocol, and essentially the Kyoto Protocol said that the 36 richest nations in the world would reduce their greenhouse gas emissions to 5% below 1990 levels by 2012. And there were no binding obligations on the 156 developing countries of the world, the poorer nations of the world. And some of these were pretty large countries. Countries like China, India, Brazil, Indonesia are very large countries. And the Kyoto Protocol created some very interesting market-based mechanisms. First one was international emissions trading, where countries that have capped their emissions to that 5% below 1990 levels were allowed to trade emission allowances. So if a country was able to get below their cap, they could sell the amount of emissions they were allowed to another country. There was the joint implementation, where rich countries would buy emission reduction units from other rich countries. And then the clean development mechanism is one of the most well-known market-based mechanisms coming out of the Kyoto Protocol, where rich countries would buy certified emission reduction credits from projects in developing countries. And this really was the foundation for offsets, where the rich countries were investing in actions that would reduce emissions in the developing countries, and that clean development mechanism really was kind of an early player in the global carbon credit offset market. Now, the Paris Climate Agreement came about in 2015 at COP21, the Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and 196 parties signed on to the Paris Climate Accord. Now, the Paris Climate Accord said that we want to keep global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius and preferably, 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. Now, unlike the Kyoto Protocol, which was only binding upon the 36 rich countries of the world, and there were no binding obligations on the 156 poor countries of the world, the Paris Climate Accord is a binding agreement upon all nations, both rich and poor. If you take a look at that figure on the right there, you can see that China has overtaken the United States as the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases. And it looks like since 2015, China has emitted more greenhouse gases as a nation than the United States has. Now, certainly on a per capita basis, China's emissions is about half of the United States emissions. On a per capita basis, China is emitting somewhere around 7 tons of carbon dioxide per person, and the United States is around 16 tons of carbon dioxide per person. But regardless, the Paris Climate Accord acknowledged that all nations on Earth are emitting greenhouse gases, and even some of the developing nations of the world are significant emitters of greenhouse gases. So all nations were to come up with a nationally determined contribution, and they were allowed to make their own nationally determined goal for how they would reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And there was supposed to be, enhanced transparency framework so that, all the nations would be transparent about their goals. But the real question is, are these nationally determined contributions enough to accomplish the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius? The Paris Climate Accord provided some new finance and technology mechanisms, and it's been a bit of a hot potato here in the United States, where President Obama signed the Paris Climate Accord. The next president, President Trump, withdrew from the Paris Climate Accord, and then the next president, President Biden, joined up with the Paris Climate Accord again. So the United States is not doing a great job of sending a clear signal to the world on its policy response to climate change. Now, because the United States at a national level has not been very clear about climate change and clear national policies, there's been some attempts by the states to address climate change at the state level. Now, back in 2009, the United States almost passed a cap and trade bill, where the Waxman-Markey bill passed the House to set a cap on carbon emissions and to create a cap and trade mechanism to accomplish that. But that the Kerry-Boxer bill, the Senate version of that cap and trade program, failed in the U.S. Senate, and there's been very little movement in the U.S. Congress to limit greenhouse gas emissions at the national level since that attempt in 2009. Now, because the federal politicians are not taking the lead on climate policy, some states are trying to act on their own or in a collective. California has been one of the primary states that has passed a law to limit greenhouse gas emissions in the state of California. That was Assembly Bill 32 back in 2006. Other states have also passed laws to limit greenhouse gases. The Western Climate Initiative started in 2007, and most of the states in the United States have withdrawn from that, except for California. But there is another state initiative that is limiting greenhouse gases in a regulatory environment, and that's the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. 10 states in the northeast part of the United States in 2009 set a limit on greenhouse gases and also set up a cap and trade mechanism to accomplish that goal of limiting greenhouse gases in those 10 states in the northeast. Now, when the United States was withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement in 2016, there were some states that said, well, if the United States isn't going to take action on this, we will take action at the state level. And so the United States Climate Alliance formed in 2017, and 25 states are saying that we as a state will do what we can to accomplish the goals of the Paris Climate Accord. And Governor Whitmer here in Michigan joined the United States Climate Alliance in 2019, and the Michigan Healthy Climate Plan, which came out, I believe, in 2022, has set a goal for the state of Michigan to be carbon neutral by 2050. Now, one thing to keep in mind with forest carbon offsets, in the voluntary market, there's been some early attempts at establishing a voluntary market to have uh, to reduce greenhouse gases and to increase carbon sequestration on forests and also in agriculture. And in 2003 to 2010, the Chicago Climate Exchange was a voluntary market where participants could make goals to reduce their emissions, and it was a trading platform to sell carbon offset credits to members or others that were emitting greenhouse gases. And here in Michigan, the Forest Stewardship Program got some funding from the U.S. Forest Service and worked with the Delta Institute to create forest carbon offset methodologies. And Delta Institute acted as a project developer and aggregated a whole bunch of small landowners to access the forest carbon market. And several dozen landowners in Michigan sold some carbon credits here in Michigan, somewhere in the neighborhood of $7 per acre is the income that those Michigan landowners earned. Unfortunately, after that 2009, when the Waxman-Markey bill and the United States did not cap carbon emissions and did not create a national cap and trade program, that dramatically impacted the Chicago Climate Exchange, and the prices on the Chicago Climate Exchange plummeted from a peak of $7.50 per ton of carbon dioxide to a low of 5 cents per ton of carbon dioxide. And so the Chicago Climate Exchange folded in 2010. And even though a few Michigan landowners earned almost $7 per acre for participating in this program, what's really interesting is that even though the Chicago Climate Exchange folded, the economist Richard Sandor, who created the Chicago Climate Exchange, he did pretty good. He sold the trading platform to the Europeans, and the Intercontinental Exchange in Europe bought the Chicago Climate Exchange and the European Carbon Exchange for $622 million in 2010. So a couple landowners in Michigan made $7 per acre for selling carbon once, but the rich guy that created the platform, he did pretty good selling it. All right, so let's get back to some other policy. So I have on here, this is some draft federal legislation that people should be aware of, and I said that none are likely to pass. Well, policy keeps on changing, and I am wrong. The Growing Climate Solutions Act of 2020, it did not pass as its own independent law, but much of the content of that Growing Climate Solutions Act was included in the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act. So that policy in particular was signed into law in 2022, and the Growing Climate Solutions Act was really just looking at asking the USDA to create a list of technical assistance providers of entities that are working in carbon offset credits in both agriculture and forestry. There's some other policy that I still think is not likely to pass. That Green New Deal in 2019, that really wasn't policy. It was really more of a resolution. It's only 14 pages long, and I would encourage people to read that Green New Deal. It actually was a very interesting resolution where the authors set a goal of achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions through a fair and just transition for all communities and workers. And it called on the federal government to create jobs and invest in infrastructure and protect the environment and to promote justice and equity. And so, again, there was no binding policy or there was no appropriations of funds as a result of that Green New Deal, but it really was an important statement where the federal government says we need to invest in clean energy in a way that's going to help people and protect the environment. The Rural Forest Market Act of 2021 is to my knowledge, has not passed, and that was a bill to provide insurance on loans to nonprofits that are financing carbon projects. The 2021 Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act is policy that the Citizens Climate Lobby is seeking to pass to establish a carbon tax and to put a price on greenhouse gas emissions at $15 a ton and increase that price. And the purpose of that carbon tax is simply to make carbon or make pollution expensive. Carbon taxes are an effective mechanism, but they're not generally very popular in the United States, and so that legislation has not moved forward. Now, some legislation here in Michigan is interesting to be aware of. So back in 2020 or 2021, the Michigan Department of Natural Resources participated in a carbon offset credit project and enrolled 100,000 acres in the Pigeon River Forest up by Gaylord into a forest carbon project. And the forest products industry here in Michigan was concerned about that and thought that they didn't have enough information about what the state was doing and why the state was doing that. And so one policy response to the state of Michigan enrolling in a carbon project was House Bill 5422, where you can see the representatives here drafted a law or a bill. And this is the entirety of the bill. This is the entire text saying that a state shall not sell a carbon offset credit. Now, this bill didn't get out of committee and it was not passed, but it shows, again, a policy response to the forest products industry being concerned about how the state of Michigan was managing its forest. Now, for the folks in the forest products industry that are interested in how the state manages 4 million acres of forest, a law that already has passed is this law here. The PA 451 is the state's Natural Resources Protection NREPA, Natural Resources Environmental Protection Act, and that's been modified numerous times. And you can see here where in section 324.52503, the Department of Natural Resources is required to develop a management plan, and the state of Michigan is required to establish harvest objectives in their management plans and to put up for sale 90% of their harvest objectives. So as we'll see in this policy attempt here in Michigan, the House Bill 6067 was introduced in 2022 and was a modification of that earlier bill, where instead of prohibiting the state from selling carbon credits, it said, well, okay, the state may sell carbon credits, but it's only if these three things are happening, where those carbon credits are verified by a third party, where the sale of those carbon credits does not prevent or restrict continued land management as outlined in the department's management plans, and the proceeds of the sales are deposited into the state's Forest Development Fund, which is restricted for use on managing the state's forests. And again, House Bill 6067, I don't believe made it out of committee and it has not been signed into law. But again, this is the forest products industry having a conversation with the state of Michigan on how the state of Michigan is going to manage land for both ecological values and traditional forest products. And again, the state is required by current law to have a management plan to set harvest objectives, and the state is required to put up for sale a minimum of 90% of those harvest objectives. So for folks in the forest products industry that are interested in how the state manages 4 million acres of land, the state is currently updating its state forest management plans in 2023, and so now is a great time to be having conversations with foresters in the Department of Natural Resources on how the state is going to continue to manage 4 million acres of land on behalf of the state of Michigan. Now, here's some national policy that was signed into law in 2022. The Inflation Reduction Act is a massive investment in a whole lot of areas, including forestry and agriculture, where there's $5 billion for better forest management that's going to be implemented through the Forest Service. Over $2 billion is going to be used by the Forest Service on managing federal lands in ways that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions from large fires and be a sink rather than a source of greenhouse gases. But there's also a significant amount of money available for state and private forests. And you can see there's $450 million that'll be coming from the Forest Service in grants to help underserved landowners access carbon markets and increase sequestration on their family forests. So significant investments from the federal government in helping landowners improve the management of their land to sequester more carbon and access markets where those ecological values are compensated for in the market. Now there's a little over $22 billion that is going to agriculture, primarily delivered through the Natural Resources Conservation Service, but also through other USD agencies like Farm Service Agency. And you can see there that significant investments in some of NRCS's core programs like Environmental Quality Incentives Program or Conservation Stewardship Program or the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program and the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. So major investments in NRCS's core programs to help the agricultural community reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and increase sequestration. Again, agriculture is still a source of greenhouse gases, and forestry in Michigan is a sink. Forests in Michigan are sequestering greenhouse gases, and forestry typically gets about 10% of the funding coming through the NRCS for agricultural landowners. Forest land and family forest landowners are considered agricultural producers and are allowed to access these funds here in Michigan and nationally. All right, so let's take a quick look at the markets. After looking at some science and some ethics and policy, then the next question is what is the economic response to this? How do we tackle these problems? And there's two major approaches to the economics: a carbon tax or a cap and trade program. Where a carbon tax, the goal is to make pollution expensive, and where the government taxes the emissions of greenhouse gases and uses that revenue to invest in new green technology or adaptation, or potentially even provide a rebate to consumers who are going to be paying higher prices for everything that's impacted by fossil fuels and greenhouse gases. So the carbon tax is an effective policy choice, but it's not a very popular policy choice in the United States. So most politicians over the last 30 years have been looking more at the cap and trade approach, which is really designed to try to find efficiencies in the market and to foster innovation in the private sector. And cap and trade has been used in other environmental problems, most notably by a Republican president, George Herbert Walker Bush. Back in 1990, established a cap and trade regulatory program to control the emissions of sulfur dioxide, which was causing acid rain here in the northeastern part of the United States. So cap and trade is a more culturally acceptable approach to reducing greenhouse gases here in the United States. And then there's two, approaches within the cap and trade system as well. One is the regulatory market, and then the other is the voluntary market. Now, the regulatory markets are required by law, and the state of California and those 10 states in the Northeast and the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, they have a cap that limits the amount of greenhouse gas emissions in that state, and they have instituted a system where emitters are allowed to trade allowances or to purchase offsets. This figure here is really quite interesting. This is a really nice illustration of the market-based approach to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That dotted red line is the cap. That's the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are allowed to be emitted. And you can see here that on the left side, emitter A, they have pretty high greenhouse gas emissions and they're above that cap. And if it's too expensive for them to invest in technology to reduce their emissions below that red dotted line, they can go over to emitter B on the right, who's already below the cap, and they can purchase allowances where emitter B is allowed to emit more than they are, and emitter B can actually sell their allowance to emitter A, or there are offset credits where there are projects that are increasing sequestration of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, and that creates an offset credit where emitter A could purchase an offset credit from a forestry project where landowners are sequestering carbon in the soil or in the trees, and can monetize that quantity of carbon and sell that to emitter A. So that's a really helpful figure to help visualize these cap and trade markets. Now, the voluntary markets are growing in popularity in part because many companies are voluntarily, it's not required by law, but many companies, because of corporate social responsibility, are trying to establish net zero goals. And because it is expensive to reduce greenhouse gas emissions below current levels or a cap that requires significant investments in technologies, and those technologies can be expensive. If a company is not able to reduce their emissions to zero, and not many will be able to do so anytime soon, the way to get to a net zero emissions is to purchase offsets or allowances from others so that you can have a net zero overall greenhouse gas emissions. So those net zero goals that corporations are voluntarily setting are creating quite a bit of demand for carbon offset credits. Now, these voluntary markets are relatively transparent in terms of having well-defined rules and tracking these credits with unique identifying numbers on these registries, and making sure that they're as transparent as possible, but it's not complete transparency. These voluntary markets are often over-the-counter transactions, and the buyers are not required to disclose who the buyer is or what the price is being paid for these carbon offset credits. And there's a couple of real key concepts that we need to be aware of in the carbon offset market world. These concepts of verifiable, permanence, additionality, and leakage. Verifiable, we want to make sure that these carbon credits can be measured independently, and make sure that the quantity of carbon offsets that are being sold is accurate. We want these carbon credits to be permanent. If we're going to be mitigating climate change, we need to have long-term or even permanent reductions of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And then additionality is a really important concept. Is it additional to business than usual? If someone is being compensated for business as usual, doing what they've already and always been doing, it's really not doing anything to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We want to incentivize people changing their behavior to increase sequestration, not merely compensate them for business as usual. And then the idea of leakage. If we are going to pay someone to produce a carbon offset credit, we want to make sure that they're not displacing their greenhouse gases to somewhere else, either on their own ownership or looking at leakage at an entire market base. We want to make sure that leakage isn't displaced locally or nationally or even globally. So again, the markets, looking primarily at the voluntary markets, but this does include some of the regulatory markets. They all have registries where they're going to track and disclose the sale of credits, and these credits have unique identification numbers. We don't want to be selling carbon twice. Um, so these registries are public, and you can go on those websites there and you can look up information about each individual project and how many credits they are generating and when those credits are sold and retired. And each of these registries is going to have a standard, which is the rules for the overall market. And it's going to cover a wide variety of different types of projects. And then each specific type of project is going to have its own methodology, which is the rules on how do you go about measuring and reporting and verifying the carbon that's being sold. And in the forestry world, the three major forest carbon offset methodologies are afforestation or reforestation, which is planting trees, or improved forest management, changing how one manages their forest in order to increase carbon sequestration, or RED, reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, sometimes called avoided conversion here in the United States. Now, RED projects, the reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, are much more common internationally in tropical forests like Brazil or Indonesia or the Congo, where project developers are trying to slow down deforestation and degradation. Afforestation and reforestation projects are popular in the United States and globally. I'm not aware of any afforestation or reforestation carbon projects here in Michigan yet, but we plant a lot of trees in Michigan. Somewhere around 20 million trees are planted in Michigan every year, and we really should be taking a look at tree planting protocols to create some carbon projects from afforestation or reforestation. But we do have quite a few improved forest management projects here in Michigan, and I'll show you in a slide or two some of those improved forest management projects. And each project developer is going to come up with their own set of rules and contracts that will spell out exactly how a project and a participating landowner is going to be complying with the methodologies and the standards and the other rules of these registries. Now, there's a variety of carbon project developers that are operating in the United States and here in Michigan, and this is an overview table of some of the major improved forest management projects and developers. NCX has been very popular the last couple of years, primarily because they have no minimum size and they have a one-year contract. And that one-year contract is very popular because most of these other carbon programs, you're looking at a contract period of anywhere from 20 to 125 years. And so NCX has been quite popular for their approach that is a one-year approach to carbon sequestration. Family Forest Carbon Program is working with landowners 30 acres and up, and Forest Carbon Works is working with landowners with 40 acres and larger. Forest Carbon Works previously was working primarily on the California regulatory market, which required a 100-year monitoring period after a 25-year crediting period. That's the California's approach to permanence by monitoring the forest for 100 years after 25 years of selling carbon credits. Landowners weren't real excited about a 125-year contract, and so Forest Carbon Works is now also providing carbon projects on the voluntary market through Verra. And again, they're looking at a 25-year period of selling carbon credits and then monitoring after crediting 35 years, or if a landowner wants to do a longer monitoring period, that's still an option. Core Carbon is a program offered by Finite Carbon that is not available in Michigan yet. In the spring of 2023, Finite Carbon is hoping to roll out Core Carbon, hopefully in Michigan by the fall of 2023. This is the one program that actually does not allow commercial harvesting of traditional forest products. All of the other carbon programs here do allow traditional harvesting of traditional forest products, and they certainly want landowners to manage responsibly and to harvest less than growth. But Core Carbon in particular is the only program for improved forest management that I'm aware of that prohibits commercial harvesting, and because of that is the only approach to a carbon offset that's not going to be compatible with Michigan's property tax programs, the qualified forest program or the commercial forest program. Now, Finite Carbon and Blue Source, now rebranded as A New Climate, are project developers that work with larger landowners and 5,000 acres and up. And so these are some of the major carbon project developers in Michigan. And you can see prices range somewhere from $5 to $15 per acre for most of these carbon programs. Core Carbon anticipates significantly higher payments per acre for a landowner who is willing to not harvest traditional forest products. But for landowners that do want to continue managing for traditional forest products, which pay significantly more than carbon, landowners are looking at somewhere in the $5 to $15 per acre range, based on the best information that I have in 2023. Here's a list of 17 really big forest carbon projects in Michigan. Several of those programs on the previous page are really designed for the smaller family forest landowners. NCX, Family Forest Carbon Program, Core Carbon, Forest Carbon Works are really all trying to help make the carbon offset credits accessible to smaller family forest landowners. But the large landowners have been participating in carbon projects here in Michigan since at least 2013, when the Forest Land Group, which was the owner at the time, enrolled 230,000 acres into a carbon project on the California regulatory market. And you can see that the following year, Huron Mountain Club followed suit and enrolled in the California regulatory market. In 2017, the Nature Conservancy first enrolled in the California regulatory market. But since then, most of the large carbon projects have been on the voluntary market, working with the American Carbon Registry and their very popular improved forest management methodology, which has a relatively low baseline, which tends to create some pretty large volume of carbon for sale, especially in the early years of the carbon project, where the initial carbon stocks are typically significantly higher than the baseline. And I apologize, this is a very busy table with lots of rows and columns, but there's a lot of interesting information on this table. And you can see, I took a look at the public documents that are available at the American Carbon Registry and read through the project design documents, and where they either reported or I was able to calculate the initial carbon stocks in these very large programs, almost all of which are in the Upper Peninsula. Looks like Canada Creek Ranch is in the Lower Peninsula, and that first State of Michigan project in 2021 was also in the Lower Peninsula. But it looks like the other 15 projects are all in the Upper Peninsula. And you can see their average carbon stocks is 113 tons of carbon dioxide, and the baseline, which is an assumption on what would happen in the absence of the carbon project, that improved forest management methodology from the American Carbon Registry, the baseline is 76, and so that means that these landowners can take to market the difference between the initial carbon stocks and that baseline. And you can see that the initial sales of carbon are generally pretty large on a per acre basis, and then tend to drop off as the sequestration slows to actual biological growth over the project period. Now, I'm getting towards the end of this presentation here, and I want to give you an opportunity to find more information. There's a lot of information out there. Everything on here is publicly available, and you can find a ton of information at these registries where you can find, their standards and their methodologies and read how these markets work and how the carbon is quantified. There are some industry analysts out there that provide information, like Ecosystem Marketplace publishes their State of the Voluntary Carbon Markets. That used to be an annual report, but the carbon markets are changing so rapidly now that Ecosystem Marketplace is actually publishing quarterly reports on the voluntary market. And if you're a landowner looking for some assistance, I would encourage you to get a hold of a professional forester here in Michigan. There are several members of the Association of Consulting Foresters that do quite a bit of work with carbon projects and work with these carbon project developers that we've been just looking at to get these projects set up and to do the forest measurements and to put together the design documents. So get a hold of a professional forester if you've got more questions. If you're a landowner, and you're not already working with a professional forester, you may want to get a hold of your forestry assistance program forester at the local conservation district to start asking questions. And again, here's some contact information for the major carbon project developers that are either operating in Michigan or I wish were operating in Michigan. Green Trees does a lot of afforestation projects in the Mississippi River Valley, and again, we really need someone to come to Michigan to help us set up some carbon projects for afforestation. City Forest Credits is doing some really interesting and innovative work in urban areas with both tree planting and avoided conversion. And it'd be nice to see some city forest credit projects happening here in Michigan. But the first four folks there are six, NCX, Family Forest Carbon Works, Finite Carbon, and A New Climate. Those developers are all operating here in Michigan. And get a hold of them if you've got questions and are interested in enrolling your own land into a forest carbon project. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.